working with you. I want to go back to this regulatory reform issue because it's so important. The former SEC chairman, Mr. Levitt, basically described the CMFA, the Commodities Future Modernization Act, as, at least when he was talking about derivatives and credit default swaps, as a failure. Would you agree?
Senator, I'm
sorry. He used the word mistake.
It was a mistake.
Yeah.
I don't think I agree with that, but I do agree that we're going to have to take a very careful look at the whole comprehensive framework of requirements, regulations, constraints, incentives that exist for the institutions that play a central role in those markets. We want to make sure that the standardized part of those markets moves into central clearinghouse and onto exchanges as quickly as possible, and that's now happening because of the work we've supported. And we will look at a range of other changes, too, to try to make sure these markets function the way we need, with more benefit in terms of capacity to hedge and less risk to the system as a whole.
Why wasn't it a mistake?
Senator, I guess I think that it's just a more complicated set of problems that we created here. We have a situation where institutions at the core of the system did not understand and adequately manage the risks they face in exposure through those products and others. They did not understand the effects these things had on a bunch of other important markets for credit and equity markets as a whole. And I don't think that, but again...
So do you support the full regulation of credit default swaps?
I would support taking a careful look at how to put in place a more effective framework of regulation over the participants in those markets and the markets themselves. Open to suggestions on how best to do that, but we need to get it right. It's going to be a really complicated, difficult thing to do.
Well,
and
what scares you when I say regulation of those tools on the exchanges? What's bothersome about that?
Well, as I said, I'm fully supportive of moving the standard part of those markets onto central clearinghouses and exchanges. I think that's really important for the system, will help reduce risk in the system as a whole. I think that's necessary but not sufficient. Again, we're going to have to look at the incentives the capital requirements create for how much exposure through these instruments institutions hold. We need to look at how the hedges are treated through regulatory capital and accounting. It's an enormously complicated set of questions, and my resistance is not to the objective. It's just that I want to make sure we get it right.
And my resistance here is that I am tired of these exotic tools. There's nothing exotic about what's happened to our economy. There's nothing exotic about these people who've lost their jobs. And this is just the exotic tool of today, credit default swaps. What's going to be the tool of tomorrow that someone else uses? And so what I want to know is that this administration, which I am so excited about, I love the fact that you just said the President of the United States, and I know the President of the United States in this new capacity is going to do great things, but I want to know that this larger issue of the financial markets being out of control and the fact that they can create exotic tools faster than we can regulate them is a tremendous problem for our economy. And I want to understand how we're going to fix that and not wait for the next tool to come along.
I completely agree with you. I think you said it very well, which is that innovation got ahead of risk management and restraint and prudence. It's always the case. It's too slow to catch up. A critical objective, and I know the President believes in this deeply, is try to make sure that our system is designed with a set of rules to make that less likely in the future.
So how are you going to do that?
We're going to look.
I think Professor Stiglitz or somebody said, well, have every new tool come through a clearinghouse before it's implemented. So I'm just suggesting that as one idea that's been thrown out. But how do you approve these before they get into action? Because $62 trillion credit default swap market that blew up this whole thing is definitely not the way to go.
Well, Senator, we will be open to any suggestion we think will work. We'll consult very carefully and widely, and we're going to, I know the President wants to come to the Congress quite quickly and lay out a framework of recommendations for reforms, and if you confirm me for this job, I will play a central role working with my colleagues in the SEC, the Fed, all the bank supervisors, the accounting profession, et cetera, so we can meet the basic objective you laid out to make sure that innovation in the future does not get so far out in front of the checks and balances in the system that we're left with this level of risk and fragility in the system.
Well, I'm going to look forward to knowing and understanding some of those measures, and hopefully I will be able to know more in the next few days. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. About the potential for a continued cozy relationship between the federal government and the financial institutions that they are supposed to oversee and regulate. So my first question, you talked in your statement about comprehensive financial reform. Do you mean regulatory reform?
Yes.
Thank you. You don't. I'm glad to hear you say that you didn't have any concerns about using that term. Earlier this week, or a few days ago, there was an article in the New York Times, two different articles. Ms. Shapiro, who was the head of the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, talking about the Madoff situation and the Ponzi scheme, and basically saying that there were some issues, there are no inquiries. But in another article, this is a January 15th, so I believe they were both the same day as the statements, that the financial regulatory, FINRA, also every 2 years reviewed the Madoff books. But apparently they missed the fact that maybe Mr. Madoff wasn't actually making trades. Do you think, yes or no, that that is a failure of FINRA?
I don't think I can give you a yes or no question about that, Senator, just to be fair, just because I don't know the details of their responsibilities in that case, but I completely agree that that case...
So there was, quote, there was no evidence that the Madoff dealer executing trades for Madoff, that they, this is coming from FINRA, they're now saying they never, we don't have any proof that they made any trades, but they basically then said they also been reviewing their books every 2 years since they started. So if they'd been, if FINRA, this self-regulatory agency, had been reviewing their books every 2 years, and now we're just coming to the conclusion that they never made trades, is that a failure?
Well, I understand what you're saying. I think it's absolutely true that the enforcement mechanism failed to prevent this and to deter it and to catch it soon enough. That's absolutely true. What I don't know exactly is what their specific responsibilities were and how well they discharged those responsibilities. But it's absolutely true that the system of deterrence and enforcement failed to detect this and prevent it.
So was that FINRA?
Again, I don't, I'm just trying to be fair. I don't know enough about the details.
If you're a self-regulatory agency whose main purpose is to clean up the industry and make sure there's no problems, and you review the books every 2 years, you don't think that was a failure?
Well, I'm sure the system failed. What I just don't know is the precise details of what they did and why they missed what they missed and what their responsibilities were.
But from an overall point, wouldn't you say that that was a failure?
Yeah, I would say absolutely that the system failed in the Madoff case, like in many other cases we've seen.
Okay. Well, I think that this goes to the philosophy of how aggressive someone's going to be. Given Senator Snow's question then about the derivatives market and your answer, which I appreciate what you did at the New York Fed in setting up a system to deal with credit derivatives, which I appreciate that, but do you think you missed the growing threat of the credit default swap market? Because that was at the same time, and it turned into a pretty big industry. So
absolutely did not miss that. It was my life's work at the New York Fed from the beginning to try to make sure that we were getting the infrastructure in those markets more mature and stronger, and to make sure the institutions that were centered of those markets were managing their risks more effectively. And everything I referred to in response to Senator Snow's question was about the credit default swap market, credit derivatives markets more generally, not just in credit.
So you think the system that you set up established the oversight for credit default swaps?
Well,
in an efficient way?
Senator, what I said is that we did a range of things that were necessary and effective in making the system stronger. But we're going to have to take a broad, comprehensive look at the entire framework that surrounds derivatives and the incentives created for institutions within them. I wasn't implying to suggest it's done.
Okay, can I ask you one more question in my time? Do you support aggregate position limits for commodities and credit derivatives across all platforms so that we have effective management of this market?
Senator, position limits have played an important role in the design of our exchanges, and they play an important role in preventing manipulation and in sort of containing risk in the system as a whole. And I believe they should be effective, and I'd be happy to work with you, listen to your concerns on how best to make them effective.
So do you support aggregate position limits across all commodities?
Well,
and across credit derivatives?
I would support examining carefully how best to make sure that those limits to prevent manipulation and to ensure the basic stability, financial soundness of exchange and central clearing are adequate to support those objectives.
I know my time is up, Mr.